Good morning.
Good morning.
A little more robust, please. Good morning. Much better. Last time I was here, I had the pleasure to speak about Kant, Immanuel Kant, and ethical humanism. And thereafter, there were requests for me to codify what I had said, because I arrived with notes and then extemporized, as one does about Kant. And so this time I've saved myself the trouble. I've pre-written the paper. So I will use these as guardrails. By the way, if any of you over the course of the talk feel like coming forward, please don't hold yourself back, much as I love the gleaming intelligence of the people in the front row at the present. So Shaw's Pygmalion, a crucible for humanism. You know, the funny thing is that George Bernard Shaw was fascinated by the capacity of human beings to be more than their mores, more than their class conditioning, more than their social reflexes, and despised what he considered to be the play of manners that dominated the European stage at that time, which he felt was teaching nothing. For Shaw, the aim was to make us think first, feel second. So we had some sense of what our feelings were relating to. In other words, feelings without facts to inform them. And we all know in our civic life how dangerous that can be these days. Feelings without facts to inform them can be groundlessly misdirected by prejudice. So Shaw used humor to sugar the truths he wanted us to consider. And what annoyed him is that he thought he was giving a sugar pill. So you enjoyed the laughter and then took the pill. But most people just licked off the sugar and refused to take the pill. Part of the problem was that he was such a wonderful humorist. After the opening performance of Arms and the Man, people were guffawing with such abandon that Shaw was sitting in the audience, getting ever more morose, thinking you're not supposed to be having so much fun because you might miss the point about the absurd romanticizing of war embedded in our culture. Well, there was a large ovation. People were exulting, and then one solitary man in the back was, "Boo! Boo!" And Shaw, standing on stage, said, "I agree with you, sir." He said, "But what are two of us in the face of all this?" And so Shaw could be shady and even with himself. Shaw, along with Ibsen in a very different way, transformed the theater of his day from pat pieces about contrivances and more towards a theater of ideas where humanity or inhumanity could be showcased. Why Pygmalion? Well, whatever its artistic merits, and most of us know Pygmalion either as Pygmalion or through its offshoot, My Fair Lady, Shaw called it a romance, with his usual wry take on common concepts. Drawn from the Greek legend of the sculptor who fell in love with his creation and pleaded with and then Aphrodite brought the creation to life so that they could be wed. This, maybe sometimes to his annoyance, this was Shaw's perhaps most enduring commercial success. From an Oscar-winning movie to a multi-award-winning musicalization by Alan J. Lerner and Frederick Lowe, Pygmalion has captivated our imaginations. Why? In part, it looks engagingly at a web of human relationships, at how we mentor each other, the many hues of human concern and compassion. Also, how avidly we objectify, and the different ways we can be indifferent to each other. Yet he does this while destabilizing classic expectations of the man as the savior and the woman needing to be saved. If you hang in with the story, it's not what the story is about. Even though superficially, we remember Higgins liberating Eliza, but we don't get the other side. So this is a marvelous moral and ethical romp, as we'll explore, not just a dramatic one. The challenge again is that Shaw's play is so amusing at times, so delightful to see various pomposities get their comeuppance, that it's easy to trivialize what's happening. So, in case you missed it, which is probably unusual, but just in case, it's the story of a flower girl off the streets, guided by a phonetics professor wanting to win a bet. but really also to demonstrate how powerful phonetics can be, language can be, as he aims to change her accent and thereby her prospects, her standing in society, maybe even ultimately her ability to find her own voice, as she learns to drape her thoughts and feelings into beautifully spoken expression. The transformation of Eliza from flower girl to potential duchess, linguistically and then to some extent behaviorally, is a fascinating lab as we look at how we humans can or can't, do or don't, evolve in concert with each other. So, some original misconceptions. Initially, if you look at the play through the lens of male dominance, it's the story of a man saving a woman, alleging that how we speak and how we learn to express ourselves is transformative. And there's certainly truth there. We know that tyrannies seek to bastardize and undermine language. Right? And George Orwell warned us about this, many others. Each year, the stock of words we understand diminish, and we can spin them. There's not just fake news, they're fake words. So there is some truth, and Shaw is certainly making a point about how important language is, and how important it is that we look at how we learn it and how we learn to express it. But also, he gives us a character who is a self-absorbed genius in the field, for whom his pupils are fodder. They matter incidentally. He's interested that they be devoted to learning what he has to teach. Who they are is probably less important. Well, not probably, it's definitely unimportant to him. He doesn't care. It's the crusade that matters to him. But the self-absorbed devotee of language and phonetics finds his sequestered world shaken by this most improbable of intruders into his well-cloistered life. This was nothing he signed up for, because this flower girl, as painted by Shaw, talented beyond initial appearances, aren't we all? Talented beyond initial appearances, with her native independence, with her ignorance of how to socially defer, without knowing how to show social gratitude appropriately, but with a burgeoning fighting spirit to show his assumption that she could learn to be right, also provokes, irks, destabilizes, vexes, and galvanizes. Now, at times this makes for rich fun at the expense of everybody's mores, but Eliza isn't a diffident receptacle. This is a spirited, emotional woman who can be temporarily, at times, overwhelmed by her teacher and mentor, and all that is new to her in her circumstances. Who wouldn't be? It's a different world she's now interacting with, but who ultimately will not be cowed. And that is why she transcends being just a pupil. Her inner fire infuriates him and fascinates him at the same time. Her distinctive humanity is one that he has to grapple with because she will not dampen it for the purposes of the experiment. Advertently in some ways, inadvertently in others, Higgins stokes that fire and himself gains grudging illumination from it. And so, if we only see this as Higgins liberating Eliza, not the other way around, we miss half of it. Us modern folk, though, of course, because we have our own blinkers, we tend to say, no, forget that. It's about a talented lout, Higgins, being put in place by the budding individual expression of a spirited woman. Also, only a partial understanding of what we have. Because let's remember, Eliza lives in his home. She has a support structure in the kindness of a Colonel Pickering, who's just come back from India and has recently moved in, but the somewhat maternal oversight of a curmudgeonly housekeeper, Mrs. Pierce. And Higgins, for all of his bullying and hectoring, his taunts, his shabby, emotional bedside manner, which we can all decry, is dedicated to her success. Truly, he needs her to succeed. And while he might walk over her towards that end at times, they dine together, they socialize together. He introduces her to his mother and their social circle of harpies, brazenly. and without apology. These are not the actions of someone trying to undermine someone. He does very much become a conduit to a larger world. Now, Eliza, in time, makes much of that world her own. But she needs the raw material to fashion herself from it. And this raw material Higgins provides willingly, in fact, bountifully. There's a dance afoot here. So the romance that Shaw spoke about was an atypical romance. Shaw suggests that Higgins romances Eliza's spirit by engaging her, by exposing her to beautiful settings and exciting opportunities, by providing a context for her to persevere in platforms, for her quick ear, and her capacity for adaptation to express themselves. All of us need moments where we can shine. We all need moments where we can flounder if we must, fail forward if we need to. So this is a romance in that sense, and Eliza comes to care for Higgins. We see that. She's been willing to make herself vulnerable, to be open to these opportunities. She agrees to live in relatively intimate circumstances with these two gentlemen, even though she had a father as a role model who was anything but a role model of how men behave, who looked to her primarily as a source of income. She is therefore naturally hurt when Higgins behaviorally is indifferent, deeply stung at times. But equally, when she accuses him for not caring about her in the aftermath of a great social success, she goes to this embassy party, is hailed as a lady. When she shines, she charges him of thinking of her only as a means of winning his bet, because Higgins and Pickering are talking about, thank God it's over, and they ignore her. And when she says that I'm nothing to you, he is incensed. He gets irked, and he says, you have wounded me to the heart. Well, this is a shocking emotional confession for Higgins, given the armor of his detachment. The armor has here been breached. So yes, we can say Eliza comes to have deep affection for Higgins, but is not enthralled to him ultimately. Who she is becoming is far too important to become anybody's trinket. She's not looking to be adored. She is not looking to be flattered. She wants to be genuinely affirmed, loved. And Higgins' love is quite quixotic. He'd never call it love. He loves her perhaps as much as he can love anybody, and there lies the rub. He says, quote, I've learned something from your idiotic notions. I confess that humbly and gratefully, and I've grown accustomed to your voice and appearance. I like them rather. When Eliza suggests he can turn the gramophone on to listen to her voice because the gramophone has no feelings to her, he says, but I can't turn your soul on. Leave me those feelings and you can take away the voice and the face. They are not you. She knows he's trying to get around her anger, but there's truth there nonetheless. So it's a romance of both purposeful and inadvertent growth. The great writer Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, who wrote Le Petit Prince, The Little Prince, once wrote, perhaps love is the process of my leading you gently back to yourself. How fascinating. To you, not who I want you to be, not who I'm hoping you would be, but gently back to yourself. And here this happens with both selves expanding, though not gently, in any way that we can talk about. And now we get to the crux of the issue, the ending, so to speak. Because Pygmalion and My Fair Lady here diverge. Shavians consider My Fair Lady's ending to be a cop-out. In Pygmalion, to the surprise and shock of many, Eliza and Higgins don't reconcile. She opts to marry her bumbling suitor, Freddie Eynsford Hill, instead. Leave it to Shaw, of course he would do that. However, we should admit, even on the face of it, that ending in Pygmalion is inconclusive. Because Eliza heads off at the end of the play, after all, with Mrs. Higgins, to church, to see her declassed father married against all of his protestations, and we can leave that aside, a discussion for another time. However, as she leaves, she has placed calls to organize the household, reminds Higgins about neckties and where they are, and orders some cheese. With all the speculation, therefore, that this ending engendered, Shaw, of course, had to intervene and provide what he called a sequel, which was really an epilogue, because he didn't want us to leave it to our romantic imaginations and mess things up. In the epilogue, he confirms that Eliza marries Freddie, but also confirms her ongoing close affiliation with the household, getting periodic help from Pickering and from Higgins, and the fact that she occasionally and periodically so aggravates Higgins that Pickering has to plead with her to be kinder to him. Power has swapped here a little bit. And so, even in this Shavian epilogue or sequel, you have to wonder, without a robust emotional bond, how would she be able to get to him? This man who came across as so impregnable. And why would she get a little bit of a kick out of doing so? We sometimes can aggravate most of the people we care about most. Otherwise, we just eventually say, I'm done with it, the hell with it. But here, this dance continues. And towards the end of the epilogue, even Shaw has Eliza thinking about what it might be like to get Higgins alone on a deserted island, when he's without his social and personal reinforcements and might have to make love like an ordinary man. But it's just an imagining Shaw confirms of the type we can all have from time to time. He comes in to tell us that Galatea, the statue brought to life by Aphrodite, never does quite like Pygmalion. His relation to her is too godlike to be altogether comfortable. Well, she may not like him, but even Shaw doesn't tell us she doesn't love him. Well choreographed. My Fair Lady, superficially or on the surface, has Eliza coming back to Higgins, as does indeed the film version with Leslie Howard, much to Shaw's enduring annoyance. Of course, it won an Academy Award. And My Fair Lady has continued to fill the coffers of so many things that Shaw cared about in his aftermath. But the musical's ending is also inconclusive. And I'll be fascinated to see how Bartlett Sher, who's producing My Fair Lady in Lincoln Center this coming spring, after a long gap from the stage, is going to play it. In the musical, Higgins, after Eliza in this version, storms out. She's not going to church. She's just leaving. Engages in a marvelous musical tour de force. First rages against her, angrily belittles her choice of Freddie, and then finally succumbs to his feelings. Confessing, quote, her joys, her woes, her highs, her lows are second nature to me now, like breathing out and breathing in. He concludes simply, I've grown accustomed to the trace of something in the air, accustomed to her face. And he sits there in the musical, shattered, listening to the gramophone, and Eliza slips in and substitutes her living voice for the recording. He sits up shocked, relieved, as joyous as he's ever going to let himself be. All he can get himself to say, though, softly is, Eliza? And once he's sure it is, in mock annoyance he says, where the devil are my slippers? And she smiles, having seen the recently distraught man now enlivened by her presence. And of course he doesn't really expect her to get her slippers, nor does she make any move to get them. The music swells, the curtain falls. In fact, in the London revival with Jonathan Pierce, when he says the final line, the director has Eliza look at him in mock irritation as if to say, really? You know, when he says, where the devil are my slippers? And he gets up trying to look stern. And then they both lose it. Laughing delightedly, finally as equals, as then the music swells and the curtain comes down. Musicals, too, can evolve in their portrayal. But what happens next in this musical version? Again, we don't know. All that's happened is she's come into the living room. The peace might last a day before Shaw's predictions come true, or maybe in this alternate universe, Eliza's more definitive early threat of leaving altogether might have had Higgins face more directly his horror of that being true, opening a window to other possibilities between them. I don't know. Depictions of Higgins. And this humanity crucible only works if there are two humans there. So depictions of Higgins as an overbearing ogre undermine the richness of the tale. And depictions, as I said, that undermine her valor, her courage, her independence, undermine the richness of the tale. We heard a paper at a Shaw conference. I had an eminent Shaw scholar, Bob Gaines, sitting just behind Dan, and behind him the artistic director of the Shaw Festival. So yeah, we have some firepower here. But we heard a paper at the Shaw conference suggesting that Lady Hamilton, known colloquially as Lord Nelson's mistress, might have been the inspiration for Eliza. After an impoverished young life and an early career as an actress and an entertainer for various well-heeled men, Lady Hamilton, the later Lady Hamilton, came under the wing of Charles Francis Grenville. He took her in, had a civilizing influence on her, but of course they were also lovers. I mean, everybody she was with, that was part of the price paid. She went on to become the muse of the artist George Romney. Later, when Grenville decided to marry someone else whose money he needed, she was passed on to Sir William Hamilton. Heartbroken, but eventually a quasi-happy marriage, and after his death, she became Lord Nelson's mistress. In the words Shaw uses, she literally became consort for a king. Close enough, anyway, in the case of Nelson. But note with Higgins, unlike that tale, there are no sexual favors involved. He takes in someone he barely knows, towards whom social disdain, because of where she comes from, would have for most people prohibited any optimism about her capability. And he does it for the sheer intellectual challenge and thrill. He mentors her, exposes her to society, welcomes her into his home, and even when she refutes him ultimately, he continues to care for her, even in Shaw's sequel. When challenged in the musical by Pickering for acting as if Eliza didn't matter at all, well, in both plays at different times, he says, what could possibly matter more than to take a human being and change her into a different human being by creating a new speech for her? Why, it's filling the deepest gulf that separates class from class and soul from soul. She matters immensely. Later, when Eliza points out that Colonel Pickering treats a flower girl as if she was a duchess, and that's how she learned manners, Higgins, of course, can't take that and says, well, I treat a duchess as if she was a flower girl. He says the great secret, Eliza, is not having good manners or bad manners or any particular sort of manners, but having the same manner for all human souls. In short, behaving as if you were in heaven where there are no third-class carriages, and one soul is as good as another. Well, he still has some growing up to do, but at least on that front, he's reasonably credible. When his attempts at influencing her and browbeating her fail in the face of her budding personhood, we must remember, though, that's when he says, 5 minutes ago you were like a millstone around my neck. Now you're a tower of strength, consort battleship. I like you this way. So, let us concede this imperfect human, this imperfect teacher, this emotionally unintelligent professor of phonetics and linguistics, does something no normal person would have done, probably. No one with a conventional definition of kindness, of the charming bedside manners of Colonel Pickering, or the expected youthful ardor of Freddie Eidsford Hill, would have seen so far beyond her sooty initial exterior. No mainstream person would have done anything as radical, nor have inspired her own creative initiative as Higgins did. It took a real original, magnet as he could be. On the other hand, she responded by becoming a catalyst in turn. by being someone he couldn't get around, so they became kindling for each other. So here's a world, if you look at this as a crucible, that eventually transcends caste, transcends blinkered social roles over time, exposes mutual hypocrisy, not just what she grew up with, but his own personal hypocrisy gets exposed, where fellowship and competence enable aspirations, minds and hearts both get educated, though with a lot of emotional volatility. Pygmalion has become an archetype for a lot of other dramatic presentations. Educating Rita, anyone ever see that? The play, the movie, given marvelous screen life by Michael Caine and Julie Walters. John Morell's Taking Shakespeare, enlivened formidably by Martha Henry at the Stratford Festival, is another more recent offering that comes to mind. In the first, Educating Rita, the teacher is not teaching phonetics, but using English literature and companionship to impart a culture that liberates Rita to eventually find her own voice and outgrow her own moorings, and eventually even outgrow her teacher. In the latter, Taking Shakespeare, which I hope will make its way eventually here, if it hasn't, a slacker, a modern attention deficit riddled student, runs into a burnt-out professor, and over Othello the teacher is renewed and the student is awakened. But never has this dalliance between teacher and student, between a creative catalyst and the person being created, with the eventual inversion of who holds the more power, been portrayed so unforgettably or so thoroughly with such romance as in Shaw's marvelous, challenging, provocative tale. Shaw's own conception with which we can finish off what we are here to do with our human experience is quite unambiguous. And this is a quote you may have come across, but it rewards listening. Maybe in the same way as you were listening to Satie. With both perspicacity and maybe a measure of a mind both slightly open and slightly befuddled, or whatever it was. Shaw says this is the true joy in life, the being used for a purpose recognized by yourself as a mighty one. The being a force of nature, instead of a feverish little clod of ailments and grievances, complaining that the world will not devote itself to making you happy. I am of the opinion, he says, that my life belongs to the whole community, and as long as I live, it is my privilege to do for it whatever I can. I want to be thoroughly used up when I die, he writes. Boy, did he pull that off. I mean, he was taken to the hospital when he fell out of a tree he was pruning at 94. Somebody asked him how it was. He said it hurt. So he says, I want to be thoroughly used up when I die, for the harder I work, the more I live. I rejoice in life for its own sake. Life is no brief candle for me, he writes. It is a sort of splendid torch, which I have got hold of for the moment, and I want to make it burn as brightly as possible before handing it on to future generations. So Shaw, the sugar pill-coating truth dispenser, the humorist who had famous run-ins with famous people, we all know that wonderful encounter, possibly apocryphal, when he said to Churchill about the opening night of Pygmalion, I'm sending you 2 tickets, bring a friend if you have one. To which Churchill reputedly, again probably apocryphally, replied, cannot make the first night, will attend the second if you have one. Another of his jousting partners was G.K. Chesterton, who upon seeing him said, looking at you one would think there was a national famine. It was a very, thin, like a reed. And Shaw looked at him and said, looking at you, one would think you were the cause of the national famine. At any rate, so one remembers the jester. And in writing about Shaw, Churchill said that the greatest living man of letters in the English language was saint, sage, and clown. Well, reading Pygmalion becomes a crucible, suggesting a world where we fashion choices for ourselves but with each other, where fresh stimuli can liberate if we offer it to each other, where teacher and student can exchange roles, and love comes in many different forms and sometimes aggravating shapes. We're being open to shedding our limiting selves and having the courage and creativity to claim a larger life and then be accountable for it. Creates new worlds of possibility for both ourselves and others in our ambit when we do. Is that what Shaw really intended with this play? Who knows? As he said, you look in a mirror to see your face, you look at works of art to see your soul. But that's a two-way street, and when what we see today and what people might have seen before could be rather different, but it doesn't matter. I really believe if you read this play expansively, in the way that we've suggested, then what I've just talked about, where we become enablers for each other, become architects of possibility for each other, is what you will exfoliate from this play. Thank you very much.